Hello, hello. This is Peter, and today we'll talk about GitHub Coding Agent and using model context protocol servers, and in our case, Learn MCP server. Okay, let's start with GitHub Coding Agent. When you have a look at the website of github.com/features/copilot/agents, you'll see that there's the interface of GitHub, but then with interactions that are assigned to Copilot, right? And you see Copilot start work, Copilot reporting progress, creating pull requests, and additional artifacts in GitHub and in your code, right? So you can have GitHub Copilot manage the code in your repository, which can be anything, right? It can be a website, the code for a console app, or maybe even a presentation, as we'll look at. What's interesting is that GitHub Copilot Coding Agent now has an option to add MCP servers. So Copilot can only access content in the same repository as the assigned issue. However, you can configure a model context protocol server so that it has additional context. How does that work? You go to the settings of your repo. Then there's the coding agent section. You can add a MCP config section, which is similar to other JSON configurations that you may have done. As you can see, there's a section of an MCP service array, and then you give it a name. And in our case, just the URL and the type. So the type is HTTP and the URL is the Learn MCP server URL, which we'll take a look at next. But there's examples for other types. So you can have a local server that runs using npx. You can have a local server that runs a Docker container. There's the Azure one, which uses npx2. And here's the SSE, the streaming events, which is older. Nowadays, most MCP servers use HTTP, the streaming HTTP protocol. Okay, so if you haven't seen other videos I made or other stories around Learn MCP, Microsoft Learn is the central location that contains all the product documentation for Microsoft services and products. Normally, you use a browser and go to http://learn.microsoft.com. That's where you can access it using a browser, but your agents don't have that access, or they can, that then searching becomes a lot less efficient. Instead, there's model context protocol, which is a direct interface to a certain environment through the idea of an API, although it's not a traditional API. Because simple request and response don't work, but it gets a stream of responses back, and so the technology is a bit different, but the idea is you ask it a question, you get a response. Learn MCP has a bunch of explanation of what it does, about capabilities, about the endpoint. And here you see an example JSON configuration that may look similar to what we'll use in the repo. Okay, the first test I did, this is about a month ago, is creating a new repository, and I didn't add any of the code in this myself manually, right? I made an agreement with myself to only work with Copilot. And so I interact with Copilot using issues. There's one open, which is an issue in Dutch, just to make sure that GitHub Copilot, or to test GitHub Copilot in other languages than English, but this worked. But I didn't add it because it would add Dutch content, which is not that accessible to anyone else. Okay, so I started here with set up Copilot instructions, create a welcoming README with the project description, usage instructions, contribution guidelines. So that's the issue I entered. And then I signed it to Copilot, and Copilot started to work, right? And it did this. It created a pull request, and you can see all the steps that it took to go through that pull request. Right, there's a language, it says changes to the README. I added a project doc, getting started, users discussion, all those things. And it has a plan. So first it tries to understand what you are trying to achieve, and then it breaks it down into tasks. Here there was a plan. How do I see the details of the plan? This is the change. Okay, let's go back to the issue, because you could also still see the session. This was the PR. Right, here's the session of the agent. So you can see the agent at work. Right, it has a sort of a monologue. It starts with the GitHub MCP server, and it starts with the Playwright server. So the GitHub MCP server is the interface for an agent to connect with the GitHub repo, and Playwright is the way to interface with web browsers in general, so it can browse to do things. What does it do? Let me check all the files. Let me check if there are any packages or source code. I don't think at that time there was any. Now I understand the context. This is a test repository for GitHub Copilot, and the current README is very minimal, with just a repository name, right? So I created the empty repo, right? And let me create a plan. And so this is the plan. Explore structure, create a repo with welcoming documentation, project description, etc. Review and verify changes. Okay, and so this is what it did. It changed a bunch of things. The README added additional sections. And then it closes the pull request. Or it opens it, actually, let me see the pull request. It leaves it for the viewer, right? View session, view the changes. Copilot finished the work. Copilot requested a review. So, and then I reviewed it and marked it as complete and merged the thing, and I can undo that still. So that's how code or text entered the README. Right, building, there's a project description, the getting started, the usage instructions. Okay, and so that was just the README, and then I added things to add a console app. So there's a .NET console app, just to to see what it does to create technical artifacts. And I also did a MARP presentation. So there's a markdown version of a presentation. Here you see indicators for the builds. And so all of this is, I haven't done this, right? This is all added by Copilot. Building the app, running the app, and there's the presentation. And so it also configured the GitHub pages to actually deploy this thing to. So MARP, if you know it, it's relatively simple. I made it style a bit. What is MARP? And then I just asked it for additional context using learn content. And at the end, this is what I did earlier today. Added a closing slide. We can have a look at that. here's the issue, the closed issues. You see everything was done last month. I did the closing slide here, and all I said is update closing slide. Oh no, I actually added a bit more details here. The final slide of the mark presentation is empty, updated in the style of the opening slide. The header should just say thank you. Subheader should show this link. Right, so you see that if you want to fine-tune a certain piece of work, then you want to add additional details. For instance, I also wanted to have this MARP presentation deployed to Azure Static Web Apps so that I could see how GitHub Copilot could integrate with Azure environments. Then the assignment was really straightforward, right? To create a GitHub action that deploys the MARP presentation to Azure Static Web Apps. That was it. No other details. And so that's what it did too. It opens a pull request to start the work. Then this is already the summary, right? And it says add static web app service token. So that's the thing I had to add to the settings of this repo to make sure that GitHub Copilot has access to my Azure Storage account. Fixes. Here you can go through that same session. And what was different that I did here is that I actually did integrate the Learn documentation MCP server. Right, and because it's accessing Microsoft service, it actually used it. Right, because if you just do generic things that GitHub can manage on its own, it doesn't need the Learn MCP server, but in this case, it did something Azure. So that's where it did use Azure. It was trying to first understand, like it's every time it's a new incarnation of an agent, so it doesn't understand, right? So it has to set the context. Like what's in your GitHub repo? What does the presentation look like? Good, I have an understanding of the repo and existing workflows. Now let me research Azure Static Web Apps deployment requirements using Microsoft documentation tools. So that's what it did. Go to Microsoft Docs search. And it got a bunch of responses, right? That's how the Learn MCP server works. It gives 10 responses. Great, now let me get more specific. So then it uses one URL to get all the details, right? It says, I want to get the build configuration. Perfect. Create a new GitHub action. Configure the build presentation. Deploy Azure Static Web Apps. And the workflow will need an API token stored as a secret. So that's what it configured. On the left-hand side, you can see there's now a new workflow, right? On workflow dispatch branch for the MARP path. The job is build and deploy, check out code, set up node, compile the MARP slides to HTML, deploy to Azure Static Web Apps, and then obviously it needs that same token, upload, dist, close, okay. The same happened here, so there's a long story about all the details it did. And then at the end it says a summary, what was delivered, the workflow, the docs, updated the README, it did some quality checks, code review, security scan, YAML validation. And so next steps for the repository owner, this is what I had to do, create a static web app because it didn't have access to the thing yet. So I went to Azure, created a static web app, got the deployment API token, added it to the repo, and then it was done. So this is the pull request. And at the end of the pull request, you can see that I merged it here, one similar comment. Yeah, it started two builds. Not sure exactly why that is. Anyway, in actions, you can see that it created an additional action. Right, there's the console app, there's the Copilot Coding Agent, there's the deploy MARP to GitHub Pages and the MARP to static web apps. This is new. It ran a couple of times. It takes about a minute to create an update. And so this is the Pages version log with my domain /GHCP test. And as I said, I also put it in Azure Web Apps. And this looks the same, but this is obviously very different. I can show you that in a bit. So this is my Azure subscription. And when I go to static web apps, the bottom, GCP test, here it says orange smoke something, view your site. And this is the website. Okay, so what's the point here? The point is that normally I use GitHub Copilot in VS Code. But that is relatively simple since you have, there is an agent active and you can have a conversation. You can say, do this, do that, do that. But I think this is much more, the idea of delegating. So you delegate a piece of work and it does a bunch of work and then it comes back to you and it provides a completed pull request to review and accept. And so in this case, as I showed with the history of issues, there's 24 issues that I created and assigned to GitHub Copilot and had it run. Add an MIT license, create a code of conduct, create a contributing MD, create a source folder with a .NET console app, add git ignore, create dev container, add security, test the app, review the README, right? Because at sometimes Copilot automatically updates documentation, but sometimes it doesn't. So you have to do things specifically. Create a MARP presentation, update the styling of the MARP, add a slide on how to create an AI Foundry issue. What else is interesting? Here, so as you see, the console app is really simple. Right? Update program.js. It's just one test to update that there's a test. And the MARP folder is also very simple. It has a README, right? What is MARP? It has slides. The slides folder file is just one markdown file with multiple dividers for each of the slides. And there's a specific added documentation on how to deploy to Azure Static Web Apps. Pretty cool, right? Okay, time to close. Thanks for watching.